Hello, everybody, and welcome to Free Thought Blogs, our Podish-Sortacast, episode number 5. And today what we're going to be talking about is the usual pandemic stuff, all that thing that's engaging us so much lately. And joining us here, we have H.J. Hornbeck, our technical maestro, who's going to be doing stuff behind the scenes. And also, I'm supposed to warn you, he's going to talk about math later on.
There will be a
Don't
lot
panic.
of math. There will be a quiz.
Yes.
I will have equations on the screen. It's going to be a thing.
Yes, so you may actually fail this podcast if you don't listen carefully. And then we have William Brinkman, who's going to bring us the news from his neck of the woods. And finally, our guest this month is Tara Smith from Kent State University. Yes, she's an expert. She knows this stuff. She told me that she's been on her university's pandemic management committee or whatever. So hopefully she'll be able to tell us how to manage all this.
Or how not to, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it. So we've got 2 university people here who will talk about what universities are doing. And so first I'll just turn it over to Tara. Do you want to introduce yourself and say a few words at first, and then I'll pepper you with questions?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Tara Smith. I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist. My focus for the last almost 20 years in my laboratory has been zoonotic infections, not viruses. I'm a bacteriologist by training, and I look at a bacterium called methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA, and have focused on how that's moved between animals and humans, especially pigs, but also wildlife and other types of animals. But I also, in my teaching, I teach a course on infectious disease epidemiology for graduate students, but I also teach an undergraduate course on plagues and pandemics. So we go over a lot of the history of previous outbreaks and pandemics, and try to understand a bit beyond the science and into some of the the behavioral aspects, the sociology, the anthropology, a little bit of all of that. So unfortunately, I had a deep well of knowledge that I really never wanted to use in this way. And the past 2 years have been a little exhausting being called on for some of that.
Okay. Well, I'm kind of interested in the historical aspect myself. So where do you rank this pandemic on the scale of historical epidemics, plagues, or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's not the most deadly. You have things like the Black Death in the 14th century in Europe that killed anywhere from, a third or more of the population. But as far as more modern epidemics, it's certainly the most expensive, probably the most disruptive, because now we have a global society. So this is something that, has interrupted our lives everywhere, right? It hasn't been confined to only one country or one continent or something like that. So, I guess low-ish on the death scale, but certainly for any of our modern pandemics, looking at influenza in 1957, 1968, the last pandemics since the 1918 plague, it's certainly well above those, and well above our 2009 influenza pandemic as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you'd think with all this, this past practice, and this being a fairly mild one, we'd be able to manage it. How do you rate our management of this one?
Yeah, you'd think, and yet somehow we haven't. I mean, our technology has been great. So, I honestly, I was writing about potential vaccines in spring of 2020, February and March. I was very skeptical that we could get the vaccine out in earlier than 18 months at that point. So, what we have done with vaccination has really impressed me, has, amazed me at what we were able to do, especially with the RNA vaccines that had never been, used before in this type of situation. So I think we did great with that. I think we did, pretty good internationally with testing. The United States had a lot of fumbles with that initially. But as far as developing tests, we did great. Access, of course, is our biggest problem right now, and access to vaccines globally, of course, too. Just because we developed them doesn't mean that we have shared them as widely as we should. So that's kind of a ding against us. Masks. Again, I was really impressed in the spring of 2020 with how quickly, that became a cottage industry. People doing that. We had students here that were making them for our community and things like that for people who didn't have them, didn't have sewing machines, things like that. So that's, I think was, something done well. And even now, we have more availability, or at least we did until maybe last month, availability of high quality masks like the KN95s and things like that now are in a little short supply as everyone is trying to find those. But, the technology aspects, I think we did fairly well, but the behavior we did not listen to at all. And it's been so disheartening, to read, editorials and watch news reports of people like Francis Collins directing the NIH that said he had no idea that behavior was such an aspect, or that vaccine hesitancy would be a thing, when this is something that so many of us have been beating the drum about for decades, that vaccines are only as good as their uptake, right? So I think the behavioral aspects have been really disappointing with vaccines, with masks, with the politicization of this whole pandemic. That's really where I think we went wrong with a lot of this.
Yeah, our fellow former sibling, David Gorski over at Orac Knows he's been writing about this practically his entire career, about people with wacky ideas about vaccinations, about medication. And, so we know it's been a problem, but we have, well, I guess the thing is, how do we address that? I mean, what can we do to fix people so that they recognize that going in and getting a little pinprick of a shot is the least intrusive method we've got for coping with this?
Yeah, and I mean, that's the problem, is that there's no easy solution. I mean, all of the research looking at, vaccine hesitancy, what convinces people is when people they trust go and get vaccinated. And so it's a lot of, just hard work, lots of one-on-one work, lots of conversations, lots of trust building, before some event like this happens, which wasn't really done. And then, you have the problem that once something becomes kind of an identity, and especially part of your, political party or things like that, that it makes it harder to find people you trust who are advocating for the vaccine. I mean, you can see even now that it's been so destroyed that even when Trump, a couple of weeks ago, he talked about how great the vaccines were and everyone should get boosted, but he's been booed for that, So even when somebody who is very influential in that, once you have become kind of entrenched in that view, it's almost impossible to change it. So I think we missed a window early on, again, when this was getting very politicized, to talk to, to get some of those politicians to change their minds, then to have Trump be more active about this instead of, downplaying vaccines, downplaying masks, downplaying the pandemic in general. If that had been different, I mean, I don't think we would have had perfect vaccine uptake by any accounts, but I don't think it would have been this huge gulf between the right and the left as far as vaccine uptake.
Yes, and it's also because we have active denialists going out and misinforming the public about this stuff, and there's no check on them of any kind. And they love to abuse statistics. So like I was reading earlier that, for instance, New York schools are just a mess right now, with huge, like half the students not showing up. And they're talking about the New York hospitals are starting to fill up. And I actually read where one of these denialists said, well, but 50% of the people who are checking into New York hospitals right now have been vaccinated. Therefore, the vaccine is totally ineffective. Not caring about the fact that something like 95% of New Yorkers are currently vaccinated, and that the other 50% are coming from that 5% that are so willfully ignoring the best advice of the medical community. And I don't know how to fight that. I mean, that's math again.
Right.
So
Right. And it's hard. I mean, and again, this isn't new. We see that when we have like a measles or a measles or a mumps outbreak, mumps especially, because that's a vaccine that can wane, and people who are vaccinated can get mumps. I mean, we see that, but you're going to see that because most of the population is vaccinated. So you have this base rate fallacy that, you know, people don't get, that most of the population, when they're vaccinated, yes, you're going to see more breakthrough cases just because so much of the population is vaccinated. But also with COVID, I mean, it provides a really dramatic example that even though, you know, vaccinated people are getting infections, some of them are being hospitalized, you know, the 95% of the people in the ICUs and those who die are those who are unvaccinated. So you can still see that kind of dramatic difference when you look at these more serious outcomes of COVID. But it's hard to get those numbers out there to people who don't believe in the first place, and people who think that the numbers are being altered, and you know, the statistics are just lies and things like that. So
yes, but you know, again, getting back to a little bit of policy and all that sort of stuff, you know, when I was reading about the New York schools, when roughly half the students are absent because you know they're isolated or quarantined or whatever, and yet they keep pushing to keep the schools open, even when, and also it's that a lot of the staff and faculty are out. So you know, it's all substitute teachers coming in, and so how do you propose that we deal with that?
Yes.
I guess I could ask you more directly. Do you advocate closing the schools now, or do you have some other solution that you would think would be better?
Yeah, I don't have any great solutions. And I think that a week or two of going remote would have, you know, benefited almost everywhere, because almost everywhere has high incidence like that. They have teachers out, they have students out, they have students who are being sent in sick because that's what you're supposed to do. You know, I mean, they're just, it's a mess. And I understand that going remote also puts stresses on lots of families that, you know, it's very difficult for them to make that transition very quickly. They have jobs they need to go to. You can't just, you know, leave your 6-year-old child at home by themselves. So, you know, I think there are no easy answers. And, you know, again, I think this is one area where I've been, you know, pretty unimpressed by the Biden administration, was around testing. If we had, you know, better tests where we could, you know every day if these people were infected or not, you know, we wouldn't have to have such extreme quarantine measures and things like that. We could do some of this in a more, you know, a more, I can't think of this word I want to think of, but you know, not using such a broad brush for everyone. But we don't have that right now. You know, that's something that, again, was kind of put on the back burner a little bit until we got really hit with this, and now nobody has any access to testing or anything too. So that's making a mess of everything. But here we're fully, you know, in class in most places in Ohio. A few, especially large city school districts like in Cleveland and Toledo, are doing a bit of a remote, you know, 2 weeks or so. But most of the schools here are going gung-ho back in, and a lot of them are without masks, even, at least in New York City. Of course, they have to have masks for students and teachers. And here we don't even have that.
Right. Yeah. No, that here in lovely Morris, Minnesota, you know, population 5,000, we have one testing facility. It's the National Guard Armory, but it's entirely voluntary whether you go in and get tested. And even though it's really voluntary, on Friday we had something like 39 cases, new cases of COVID here in this little bitty town. And yet we've got classes going back into business, you know, in short order. I'm just kind of shocked that we're, you know, this is worse, a bigger spike than we had back in the spring of 2020. But what are we doing? Not same old thing. Yeah, it's kind of scary.
Yeah, and I think some of that has come from this idea that, Omicron is more mild, so now we can just put everybody back together and people will get it. I think that's the assumption, but maybe they won't die from it, so it's not as bad as 2020.
But is that true? I mean,
Well, yeah.
yeah, because now we got this baseline that's largely vaccinated.
Right.
So of course they're going to have milder effects. So I don't know if on an individual basis.
Right. And that's the $1 million question. And I'm very worried here about, our unvaccinated students, unvaccinated population. Because here at least at Kent State, we do have a vaccine requirement, but we have exemptions. So not all of our students will be vaccinated. And so I'm worried about those kids. I'm worried about, younger kids in the schools. Ohio's vaccination rates, both in, adolescents and in 5 through 11s, are pretty abysmal. So you have a lot of kids that are unvaccinated, have not been infected, are fully naive. So overall at the population level, it certainly does seem that Omicron is more mild, but yes, a lot of that is just due to population immunity. So I don't think we know really a good comparison for Omicron in completely immune naive individuals versus Delta versus Alpha. At least there may be preprints out there. I'm trying to keep up, but I haven't seen anything like that yet.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my university, students and faculty, we're now at something like 94% vaccinated, which is good. The community at large, in a small town, our students will be mingling quite a bit, is less than 50%. It's just a terrible conservative county that doesn't want to get vaccinated. So we'll have to see how well that lasts.
Yeah, we're at, I think, 54% in my county, so not much better than you.
Yeah. Okay, we do have questions in the chat, and we got these other two guys who might want to get in a word in here. But I do have one more big question, and that is I read your Quanta magazine article. I'll make sure to get a link to that included in our YouTube video. And there you're talking about the long-term future. Are we going to be able to eradicate this disease? And you say no.
Yeah.
Will we be able to eliminate this? You're kind of negative about that too. So what is life going like in 10 years?
Yeah. I mean, I'm hoping in 10 years, I think one of the best case scenarios right now is that this will be more like a seasonal flu, that I don't think it's going away. There will be vaccines. We may have to get boosters. Who knows what other variants are coming down the pipeline? What may appear in 6 months or 6 years, I don't know. But I don't think that is ever going to completely go away. So I think our winter months are always going to be a little difficult with flu, with corona, with potential vaccines for each that we may have to get yearly, who knows. But I don't think it's something that's going to go away. Right now, our vaccines are again really good at protecting against serious disease, but especially with variants like Omicron and just the waning immunity in general from those vaccines, they're not good enough to prevent outright infection in the long term. And maybe we'll have new next generation vaccines, something that I mentioned in the article. Maybe we'll have better ones coming down the road. But at least with what we have now, I don't think we have the tools, and certainly not the political will, to even work on elimination of this virus, much less global eradication, which is a huge step up over geographic elimination, which is, let me make sure I define some terms here too. So eradication means something that is gone from nature across the planet. So the only one that we have done that with in humans is smallpox. We have other viruses like measles that we have eliminated in certain areas. So measles is eliminated in the United States. That doesn't mean we never have measles infections here, because we do, but all of those stem from importations of the virus from other places. And then you have an outbreak here, and then we were able to contain it, and then it stops. So that's what we're looking for coronavirus. And I think that's going to be, very difficult to do. And again, it would take a lot of, effort politically and financially to try to do that and maintain that elimination. And I think right now, at least, we don't have the tools and we don't have the political will to do that.
Yes, I think it also is going to require a bit of a cultural shift. I mean, like last year, I wear a mask everywhere. And not only did I not get COVID, I didn't get the flu. And I was just thinking, why aren't we doing this all the time? And it might make a big difference and help a lot if we just get comfortable with, if you're out in public, put on a mask, stop sneezing on people, that kind of thing. Okay, let's see. I should forward some questions to you from the audience here. Let's see. Well, here's one. Would nasal vaccines be more acceptable to people, and they could lead to more IgA in the place where it needs to be for respiratory viruses?
Yeah, that's definitely something that's being looked at. I don't know how well it would affect vaccine hesitancy. I mean, we have those for influenza. Some years they're good, some years their efficacy is not good. So actually, in some places that can make people less likely to vaccinate just because the nasal vaccines aren't as good. They certainly could help for people who have, needle phobias or aren't getting vaccinated for that reason. And, the hope is, of course, that these would be better for respiratory pathogens, that they, they're targeting your immune system in the right place. They're targeting those antibodies that, are most important for mucosal surfaces. So those are, again, one of those kind of next generations of vaccines that if they work, if they're good, that may be another tool in our arsenal that we can use. Right now, obviously, we don't have anything like that that's quite ready, but that's certainly something that, I'm keeping tabs on, hopefully for coming years.
Right. Okay, another question here. This is one I wonder about too. What's the current fast test accuracy? How good are the tests that we have?
Yeah, and that's something I've been looking for too. We don't know for Omicron. So we know that for the tests themselves, the antibody antigen interaction that they use is still pretty good. So Omicron has a lot of mutations in the spike protein, but that's not the one that is used in these rapid tests. So that antibody antigen interaction still works. The problem is the dynamics of the virus seem to have changed a little bit. So whereas before with previous variants, and then this seemed to hold even with Delta, you have replication in the nose at a high level, like a day before you start symptoms, maybe 2 days, and then for about 2 to 5 days while you have those symptoms, and then it kind of goes away after that. It can be detectable by PCR, but not so much by antigen because the live virus is starting to go away. With Omicron, it seems to be different. There have been a couple preprints out that suggest that the saliva and maybe the throat would be a better place to test first, that it seems that there's more virus there in the early days than in the nose. So we just don't know. And I've seen so many stories of people saying, they had a few symptoms, starting mostly with the sore throat and like a headache early on, tested the nose with a rapid test, got negative tests for sometimes days. When they're well into symptoms, that's when it turns positive. So and look, but I don't think we know right now, how well the rapid tests work with regard to those differences in viral replication in the nose versus the throat, maybe. So it may be different. It's not necessarily a fault of the tests, but just the way that the virus replication has changed and the way that we're trying to use those tests.
Yeah. Let's see. And this is more of a comment. So another important change that is needed: don't force people to work when sick. In the US, remove the concept of fixed number of 6 days. That one kind of hits home to me because we just got a memo from our administration that told us, yes, if you get sick, you should stay home for 5 days. But if you try to go over 5 days, then we're going to have a little talk. They also say, "Oh, we're prepared to support you if you take off, if you have to take off for 5 days," but they don't say how they're going to support us. I can't. So yeah, this is another of those problems where we've, as we mentioned earlier, flexibility is kind of important, and I don't think most employers are willing to be flexible.
Yeah. And if that's happening at the university level, that at retail stores, at restaurants, at factories, I mean, it's 10 times worse, that they're not getting any time off. They're, being encouraged to come in sick. I know my daughter works at a restaurant and, has seen some people that are coming in, they can't afford the days off. They had a positive test, but they feel okay. So they're in working. I mean, it's just, things are not good at many of those places that don't offer sick days, that don't support keeping workers home when they're ill, that have skeleton staffs already and can't afford to, be open and have people not working. So it's a mess.
Right. Okay. Well, I could ask more questions, but let's be fair and give somebody else a chance to pester you or to tell us their own news. So, William, what have you got to say?
Oh, things are really happening in Illinois. I just found out a few minutes ago that my representative, Sean Caston, tested positive, and he's currently quarantining with his family. So I just found out about that recently, and he says he has symptoms, but he's doing okay and he's fully vaccinated. Other big thing is conflict in the Chicago school district, basically, the teachers union voted to go remote earlier this week, and because of Omicron, and the mayor, who, unlike the rest of Illinois, runs the school district, shut off remote access and said, "No, you're coming back in." So they've shut down classes since I originally thought Monday, but but for most of this week, they've been shut down over this dispute because teachers don't want to come in and Chicago doesn't want to go back to remote learning. So, which touches on what we talked about earlier. And then Chicago's health department's insisting that it is safe for the schools. They've had mitigation, and I'm not qualified to judge that. Yeah. I know some other school districts in the suburbs have had to close down temporarily, go back to remote learning due to staff shortages. And let's see, another thing, suburban Chicago as a whole, about 60% vaccination. So we're doing better than downstate, but still transmission's high in every county. That we didn't see that last year. We didn't see that in 2020, but now we're seeing that. And other thing that's been coming up is fake pop-up clinics have been appearing all over suburban Chicago. In fact, I saw about 4 when I was driving my wife to her surgery. And so we do have free clinics offered in the suburbs through the National Guard and health departments. But some people just got the idea, hey, we'll take these abandoned buildings, claim to offer tests, take social security numbers, and then run off. And some people haven't received their test results, and they're not accredited at all. So that's something that's happened recently. So kind of unique to Chicago, or maybe not. And this week we started, Cook County and the Chicago area started vaccine mandates. And so basically, if you go to a restaurant or major gathering, churches are exempted, of course.
Of course.
Yeah. And basically you need to show your vaccine card, but I will give the state credit. They have a website, and they can give you a QR code that can confirm your vaccination status. So that's pretty much it. I've been fortunate, my family has been fortunate to test positive throughout this whole thing. And
test positive, did you say?
Yeah, we've been fortunate to have negative testing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm fine. So we've been very lucky in that regard. Did have a scare this week, but it's negative. So Unfortunately, my workplace, which I won't name, wants me to come in 3 times a week. So, but I'm not going to upgrade to the KN90s and 95s, and fingers crossed. And but fortunately, my work area is pretty sparse, and so that kind of improves the odds. And I have to eat lunch outside and brave the frigid cold. So that's pretty much my report from Illinois.
Okay. Yeah. All right. The things for us to look forward to here in Minnesota, I guess. We don't have those pop-up clinics yet. I would not be surprised if they start popping up, but I think it's largely because we are incredibly slack on enforcing vaccinations and testing. That there's virtually no mandate that's in operation right now in this state. So if we get a mandate, then there'll be a nice financial incentive to come in and get your fake test.
Very true.
So we'll see. Okay, I got another question in the chat before we turn it over to HJ. And this interests me too. And it's relevant to Tara's expertise. So the idea of the zoonotic transformations through other mammalian species. So I'm sure you've heard of this idea that this is where Omicron came from, is because it just suddenly appeared in the human population. It has a whole bunch of mutations. It's like it didn't progressively emerge in our population. It must have snuck up on us somehow. And one idea is that it's been incubating in a different mammalian population, like mice, for a long period of time. So what do you think of that idea?
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. There also is, I know, at least one preprint that looked at that in a rodent model. I can't remember if they used mouse or rats or whatever, but I mean, it's definitely possible. I think it's still somewhat more likely that this came from an immunocompromised person. We also have a couple of papers looking at that from like end of 2020, early 2021, where you saw a similar jump, like, an immunocompromised person who was unable to clear this for months. And you look at the virus that was taken from them over that period, and you see a lot of novel mutations. So I think those are kind of the two competing main hypotheses right now about where this came from. And I tend to lean a little bit toward the immunocompromised one, just again because we have evidence of that happening before. Right. With rodents, I mean, it's definitely possible. I mean, I'm really interested, if you've probably seen the studies too here in the Midwest, especially in Ohio and also some in Iowa, looking at COVID in deer. So we know that this virus has jumped into deer species and is spreading amongst them very quickly. And so that's something I'm looking forward to finding more, as people publish more of that, look at how that evolves in that species over time, to see what is happening in other animal reservoirs. So it's definitely not out of the question. We know that this can jump to a lot of animal species. We know that especially when they're in large groups of animals like deer and like rodents, and we've seen this on mink farms also early in the outbreak, that this can just run through there and has the potential to gather all of these mutations over time. So definitely possible. What we're looking at is what's called spillback. So, the original spillover from the animal reservoir into humans, then humans give it to other animal species, and then it, evolves there for a while and then comes back into people. So that's what we'll be looking for pretty carefully for the next number of years, I would suppose.
Yeah. Okay. So it may have just been simmering at a low level in some unfortunate individual who couldn't get the vaccine. Oh, okay, great. Yeah. And we've got a pretty large reservoir of people who don't get the vaccine.
Oh, yeah. 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 But in immunocompromised people, I mean, especially in people that have had, solid organ transplants, stem cell transplants, We know that the vaccine just does not work as well in a lot of those people too. So even if they've been vaccinated, they may not necessarily have effective immunity. So you have a lot of people that are in that boat as well. Even if they've tried to get vaccinated, it just might not work.
Yeah. Okay, one more question before I turn it over to HJ then. So another question from the chat is, could SARS-CoV-2 become another HCOV in the future?
So an endemic human coronavirus. So we have
Yes.
4 of those already that we know of. And I mean, I think that's kind of the route that we expect this to take. Again, because, hopefully the population will have a lot of immunity soon, whether it's through vaccination or through active infection. And so we expect, but again, we don't expect this to go away. We expect this still to stay in the population. So I think that it will be like those, maybe not quite as mild. I mean, we do see occasional serious illnesses from some of the human coronaviruses, the endemic ones, but again, usually in people who are immunocompromised, who are, elderly and don't have a good immune response or things like that. So you can die from those endemic coronaviruses. It's just pretty rare. So hopefully that's what we'll see with this. Again, I still would expect to see, at least for a number of years, still see, relatively large outbreaks in the fall and winter. Hopefully nothing on the scale of what we're seeing now, but, a bump in cases, and hopefully those will not be a lot of serious cases because of the immunity in the population. But I think it will start to go more toward that route in the next few years.
Yeah, another route for gaining population level immunity, of course, is this thing called natural selection.
You might have heard of it.
Yeah. So yeah, I've also seen that for the first time the human longevity in the United States has declined in the last year and a half. So that's how big the effect is. That we're coming up on 1 million dead from this. Oh, okay. Yes, that's a cheerful note to end on.
Right.
Let's let HJ cheer us up for a little while with some math.
Oh yeah,
Take it away.
Time for the math portion. This is going to be great. Although before that, there was actually one question which snuck into the chat. I've noticed. Someone was asking about the difference between a stereotype and a variant. Well, I don't know if Pizza or Tara wants to jump in on that one.
Sure. So let's see the best way I can explain this. So serotypes refers to the body's response to this. So when you look at serology, you're looking at the antibodies that are produced by the host. Okay. And so what happens is that you can have a lot of variation within the virus that may or may not lead to different serotypes. All right. So in this case, let's talk about measles for a minute. So measles has a single serotype that circulates here. So regardless of, if you get infected with a measles virus that has some, new mutations in the virus, they're not enough to get around kind of that pre-existing immunity. So what your antibodies recognize will still be pretty much the same. All right. It's when you have differences that change those antigens pretty significantly, like we see with flu all the time, that they can cause different serotypes, so that your pre-existing antibodies won't recognize those new ones. Right? That's a really bad explanation, but basically with COVID, we haven't seen the emergence of new serotypes, even though we have seen a lot of variants. So that's something that may come in the future. I don't know enough honestly about coronavirus serology to even know if they have a scheme for that, kind of like we do with influenza. With influenza, it's based on the 2 surface proteins of the virus, of hemagglutinin and neuraminidase, which are the ones that our body really recognizes. And then we kind of group them into a bunch of different H and N types. I don't know if there is something similar for other coronaviruses.
Okay, very good. So we should turn it over to HJ, and I'll just warn you, HJ, we've got 15 minutes left.
This one might be a
we're
little bit
pushing
tight.
it. Talk fast.
There is one more question from the chat about whether or not
Oh.
Omicron is a strain or something like that. It sounds kind of like a definitional word kind of thing. A strain is sort of what we call a strain, quite frankly. So,
Uh-huh.
Omicron
It's-
has.
it's-
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Now, Omicron has a number of mutations from it. It's still considered close enough to be considered a strain of SARS-CoV-2, ergo, it's a strain. It's sort of the whole what is a species kind of thing. This is tricky biological stuff, and at the end of the day, it's oftentimes just it is what we say it is. Hopefully, that was a reasonable answer from a non-biologist. All right, with that, I shall slam through the math. I'll also share things so the people here can see what exactly I'm presenting as well. And ta-da! I'm going to be talking about modeling pandemics. Now, oftentimes as a computer scientist, it's kind of weird to sort of find any sort of relevance to what we're talking about on here because I'm dealing with abstract computer concepts. Modeling pandemics in particular has actually been one of my main focuses over the last year or so. So I can actually talk about this with some authority. When it comes to pandemics in general, there's a variety of approaches to modeling. Probably the most recent one, it relates to neural networks and machine learning. Basically just feed it into a giant black box, see if you get any good results out of it. I have seen some people claim that to have better numbers than traditional models. The problem with these things is they're basically black boxes. You don't know how they work. You don't really get any sort of insight into how the virus is transmitting. You just trust that the model works. Another approach has been sort of agent-based simulation. Like I think we've all heard of the video game The Sims, where you've got like virtual people running around interacting with one another. Essentially, that's it, but for diseases. It models how people behave and how they interact. It's actually got a really good track record, especially with HIV. The problem, of course, is it requires a ton of computation because you're dealing with, little virtual people running around in a computer. And of course, there are problems with randomness too. Rare things you have to be sort of simulated out by actually running a whole ton of simulations on that. Another approach popularized by the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, or IHME as they're more commonly known, was curve fitting. Basically, pandemics tend to follow a fairly predictable trajectory. So rather than sort of doing like the low-level physics and all that, just cheat and use a curve, which sort of models how exactly it works. The advantage of this is it's very quick and easy to sort of compute. The disadvantage is it's not necessarily all that accurate. If we go back to sort of the gold standard for how to model pandemics themselves, and also one of the oldest tools we have in our toolbox for modeling them, it's compartmental models. The idea behind this is you actually take the populace and you divide them into a series of compartments. The classic example of this is the SEER model. Everybody fits into one of three categories. You're either susceptible to the disease, you're infected with the disease, or you're recovered. And recovered is in the general sense, i.e. you either got over the disease and you're fine, or you got over the disease by dying. Both are in there. These can actually be represented in terms of what's known as an ordinary differential equation. We've got some constraints on the equation itself, such that, for instance, all of these compartments have to add up to the total population. Nobody sort of jumps in or out of the model itself. And rather than sort of describe things in terms of what individual people do, we actually relate things in terms of the change between the various group sizes. Like this first line right up here says basically that the change in the susceptible population is equal to the proportion of people who are infected overall. The idea being that if you've got a lot of infected people running around, they're going to have, a much more influence than if there's a small number around. More infected people, more spread. That's the basics of it right there. In addition, we also need people who are susceptible to the disease to come in, and that's where this fraction of S over N comes in. The fewer people who are susceptible to it, the less likely people are actually transmitted on. And then finally, beta here is just a free parameter we throw on there to sort of model the probabilities related to how things, pop out. And again, the other ones are sort of defined in very similar fashions. Now we can actually go through and solve this via a bunch of things. I mean, this is what's known as an initial value problem. They've been around at least 100 years. Ordinary differential equations have been around 400. So we have a ton of really good resources to actually solve these things. And this is literally some code I wrote to solve this year model for a variety of parameters that I've got in here. In this case, I actually did sort of a rough fit to what New York City was doing early on in the pandemic to get what some of these parameters are. So this is essentially what the SEER model predicts was happening for New York. The horizontal axis here is days from, the initial pandemic right there. And we start off with one infected individual, by the way. And then we sort of let the disease play out. You can see how there's really not much action for the first 20 odd days or so. And that's partly because we've got sort of a weird population scale going on here where you can't really see the thousands of people who are being infected. But exponential growth takes over at some point, and a huge swath of the population actually gets infected. And eventually we've got a fairly large drop off of the number of people who are susceptible overall, and a large increase in the number of people who are recovered. These parameters right here can also be tweaked. Imagine I change this beta parameter right here to be a little bit lower such that people are less likely to actually transmit the disease. What happens in this case is you actually get people who are never actually interact or get sick by the disease itself. Essentially, a large number of people get infected, it burns out, but it never actually touches some people. There's always going to be this level of people who are susceptible within the community itself. And, the recovered sort of come in and do that. It's a very graphic description of how exactly, bending the curve, making it less transmissible. And all that. That's what people are talking about when they come to this. Conversely, if we boost the transmissibility of it and basically make this a long sort of lingering disease, what you get is basically just, the disease spreads very rapidly through the population, much faster than before. And there's a very long recovery time with a lot of people just sick with the disease itself. All very cool. But why actually just limit ourselves to 3 compartments? The great thing about compartmental models is you can actually you can take this basic template and then, play around with it as much as you want. For the slide itself, I actually came up with my own model, just exclusively for this, which is a little bit more fitting for what we've got to COVID itself. People start from vulnerable, basically the equivalent of susceptible from before. And then there's sort of an incubation period, which I've called asymptomatic right here. They're building, they're actually infected with the disease and it's multiplying, but they're not actually transmissible at this point. Infectious sort of corresponds to people who either are truly asymptomatic but can transmit the disease, or have a very mild case of it, sort of equivalent to like a mild cold. And then from there, they can either progress. There's actually 2 paths. Typically within these things, there's just sort of one path that you fall through. In this case, they can actually branch off, and then they can either get over their mild case and just go back and have some immunity as recovered, or their mild case can actually progress into a serious case where they get even more sicker. In addition, we can actually branch off and have an explicit category for people who were killed by the disease itself. And that's important because we know for a lot of these coronaviruses, immunity actually wanes over time. And this allows us to add another parameter in where people who are recovered will gradually filter back into the vulnerable population because the virus itself has mutated. And again, we've got a whole, setup of mathematical equations to describe it. Very similar to what we've sort of had before, but now we've got parameters like theta and zeta, for instance, which actually control proportions. So in this case, for instance, theta represents the proportion of people who are killed by COVID, in this case, and head it off that way. Alpha represents the odds of somebody who is sick without actually spreading on the disease to somebody else. The idea being that if you're severely ill with COVID, people are going to recognize that and, either change their behavior, or you yourself are going to recognize, oh, shoot, I'm sick, and you're not going to spread it around. So you're not going to be as effective a spreader. On top of that, we can also do some other variations with this. A lot of these parameters are actually sort of fixed based on, the transmission of COVID itself. There's not a lot of variation on it on a population level for what exactly we can expect. The big one that you will actually find is this beta parameter right here. This is sort of the transmissibility of it to the vulnerable people. And we find quite often that people actually change their behavior and change this value. So rather than just have it as a fixed parameter, we actually now have it as a function, related to time, and capture more complicated, population dynamics with that. For instance, oftentimes there's a seasonal component to these. SARS-CoV doesn't seem to have much of a seasonal component to it, but it is certainly viable with it, and might just simply reflect the fact that we're for when the winter months, we're actually going indoors, and there's more points for it to potentially spread around in contact. There's also the effect of masking as well too. There after some initial period of sort of confusion over whether or not masks actually had a difference, people sort of eventually realized, oh yeah, no, it does. And now you've actually got a significant share of the population masking up. We can kind of represent this as, like an exponential decay, sort of cutting down the transmissibility of COVID overall. Finally, we can also add in sort of a panic factor. If cases go up, people actually tend to panic and change their behavior on top of that, which I'll get into more on a later slide. So we can actually sort of look at, the number of cases which are coming up, as well as the total number of cases which exist, and change, the effectiveness of this beta parameter for how much it's going to spread. And we can then sort of smush all these together into a full model. I'm going to call this a VRISCA model. Typically, when it comes to compartmental ones, you use the initial, initializations of each of the compartments that's there. So I'll use that. Instead of using the 2 parameters we had with the SIR model, now we've got 13. Obviously, a lot of these I'm just going to be filling in by just pulling numbers out of thin air. So I just sort of grind through, throw in all these various parameters that are on here related to that. And now I can actually just, run the exact same code I did before with, the updated model to get an updated prediction. And this is sort of what it comes out as. You can see we've actually got something a little bit more realistic to what we actually saw within New York City early on. Where there was sort of a flattening of the curve, of people who are infected and asymptomatic, just due to, behavior changes that are there. And I mean, that doesn't have too much effect on, the people who are sick, but you can see there's actually much more of a lean within the sickness thing. So we've actually changed the shape of it slightly. And that's all well and good. Cool. And in fact, this is the most common type of model you'll find for it. Whenever I do literature searches on SARS models and all that, it's often some form of compartmental model, which someone has invented, or come up with. So what's the problem with these things? I mean, this is century-old technology. What exactly is the issues with all of these predictions? Well, there's a lot. For one thing, this is actually what the compartmental model, this VRISCA one, predicts happens in New York City early on. Essentially, cases kind of top out at about 22,000, and they level out, and that's essentially the end of it. SARS-CoV-2 goes away, nothing happens. As all of us kind of know, that's not exactly what happened with New York City. You can see that cases, of course, have continued going up and up and up. But not only that, there was never any sort of real flat area where there were no cases in. And this is simply because a lot of compartmental models basically assume that we're living within a petri dish themselves. Everybody in New York City stayed within New York City. Nobody traveled in or out of the city itself. Obviously, this is highly unrealistic, and we're getting people traveling in. And these act like seeds for more pandemic stuff to happen on that. And unfortunately, it's really difficult to sort of model these interactions within the compartmental thing itself. It's possible, certainly. I have actually seen things like, I think the Gleam model will actually modify this for those sorts of things, but it's difficult, let's be fair on that one. On top of that, people do change their behavior, as I sort of said before. Apple has been very good about sharing mobility data collected on their iPhones, sort of revealing how people have changed their behavior over time. And when you chart that, you can see there are some big behavior changes. Early on, when the pandemic started to hit New York City, people radically changed their behavior for that. And you can see that it's sort of warbled up and down a little bit. One thing to bear in mind, though, is this isn't necessarily something that's as easy to predict or understand. Like the secondary black line right here corresponds to when New York City actually placed, mandates in and did like a full lockdown in place. You can see, people were changing their behavior for weeks before that. In fact, it coincided roughly with when they actually shut down the libraries within New York City. This isn't a mass lockdown by any means. This is just some precautionary stuff. But it was a signal to the public that this is actually something serious, and they started to panic related to that. Hence the whole panic thing that we've had there. But you can also see that between the second and third thing, this third thing is when the reopen actually started to happen and policy changed. But you can see people changing their behavior on that. So the difficulty from these is not simply, hey, we've got to sort of predict what exactly is happening, but you've also got to predict sort of the media landscape itself. How do people react when they read the news of the pandemic itself? It's a ridiculously complicated sort of chasing the tail kind of thing, which makes almost any sort of, predictions almost impossible to do. On top of that, compartmental models have another problem too. This, for instance, is the number of deaths that it predicts at the very end. It says that, at the very end of the pandemic in New York City, we'll have 1,495.582 deaths. Well, how do you have 0.582 of a death? Compartmental models assume that people are infinitely divisible, and you can actually have fractions of people who are infected, sick, or dying. And that is a problem because when it comes to sort of cases exploding, you can have 0.1 of a person there, and that can be enough of a seed to actually start a second pandemic. In practice, what would actually happen is either the disease would die off, and there would be 0 people infected, pandemic over, or there's actually community transmission, which isn't captured by the model, and so you've actually got several people who are infected, and then eventually, the official statistics come in. That's not something which is really handled well by compartmental models overall. And finally, there's a number of just odd, dodgy, assumptions made by it. I've already talked about the infinitely divisible one. But they also sort of assume that everybody comes in contact with everybody else, that there's no class stratification, everybody rubs shoulders and contacts everybody. People aren't sort of geographically constrained for who they interact with. Not really realistic for how these things play out. In addition, it sort of assumes that we're dealing with Poisson processes when it comes to how things interact. We have, hang on, I'm almost finished here. We have sort of assumptions for how the disease spreads itself and how it transmits on, which aren't necessarily modeled with what real life is. Finally, even if we could actually nail all these things, there's good mathematical reasons to think that in fact it's not going to work. Even if you precisely have a model for COVID-19 and you play that out within the populace itself, and then you actually make predictions based on that precise model, you're going to get a wide variation in what exactly the pandemic is going to do. And here we get everything from the pandemic naturally dying out to it exploding. The error bars on what exactly is going to happen is extreme. And that's simply because of the effect of exponential growth. It is ridiculously difficult to predict even if you have total knowledge. So yeah, that's sort of what I've got for predicting pandemics. We have a lot of tools at our disposal for it. A lot of really good models which help deal with this. But it is an intrinsically hard problem. And no one model has really done sort of a good or adequate job of, of detecting these things and getting it to work. So yeah, that's what I've got, for my presentation there.
All right. Very good. Yes, now we are at the 1 hour limit. So what I'm going to, I don't see any fresh questions coming up in the chat. So what I will suggest is if anybody has questions, go to HJ's blog, which is
Reprobate Spreadsheet.
Yep. And leave questions from there, and we'll let everyone go at that point. Thank you very much for Tara for showing up and giving us that informed perspective on this complicated issue. And thanks, William, for coming by and giving us the latest news from beautiful Illinois.
Yeah.
Okay, so we will talk to you all later. We'll come back in a month with, we don't know what the topic will be yet, but we'll work it out and we'll make an announcement about that. And thanks to the audience for showing up. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And with that, take it away, HJ.